Hello, it's me, BPRadiant, and we are here today to talk about something a little differently than I've done in my previous videos, and that is going to be um, how does the Historic Brawl matchmaking formula work? What do we actually know? What have we tested? And what do I actually think going forward, what I would want to do, and what I would kind of like, how I would approach building a deck in that route. Um, so, first, if you haven't, down below I will link what I'm using to cite as my source, which is WotC Cromulus kind of like in a Reddit thread on it. And then after this, I will use my conjecture that I've done over about 1,000 games of testing on what I think some of the deck weight measurements are. So yeah, let's get into this. Okay, so one of the things that I think is very interesting here, and we're just gonna kind of go through what he said and talk about it a little bit, is that it is confirmed that your commander is a large part of the matchmaking formula. So if you're playing a high power commander, you're probably gonna play other high power commanders for the most part. But he does say it's not the only factor. For instance, in the 99, there are factors they use to indicate how you approach Brawl as a format, and then their goal is to try to find something with the same approach to it. And so, for instance, you could play against someone with like a more powerful commander with a less powerful deck, or even like a really low tier commander but with a really strong deck. And it kind of just depends on how that's working. And now, so the way he makes it sound is that this is like this is not a marginal decision. And we'll kind of go into that as well, but it feels a little misleading to the community from what I've kind of done through my own testing. Um, then, of course, he says that, he's not going to go into full details because this goes to people optimizing for the game mode rather than like their own enjoyment of the game, which I totally understand. Like, people are going to want to optimize for the game mode to like win the most. It's just kind of like what's incentivized and things for what we have there. He also kind of says that, this people would debate, the fairness of single data points or even like bug if like they get matched with somebody who's not in their tier or whatever. And then also mentions one of the things he wants to do is he doesn't really feel like he doesn't think WotC is really going to ban a lot of cards for Brawl since it's a very casual format, and that instead they can probably just, because people really want to play them, and so that doesn't mean that they won't ever ban cards, but like he kind of references how this works with Paradox Engine and like the community's involvement and feeling about that, um, which I think is kind of like an interesting illusion because it kind of states that cards that are, I would say, probably like on that flip of like maybe too good or need to be banned might get put more on, say, for instance, like a higher data point for like the deck weight and power. But that's not all he says. So in a comment a little further down, he also says something very interesting and how this differentiates from how the play queue is rated with deck weight. And that's that rarity does not influence the system, and it's all based on individual cards, which I think is very cool, especially considering that, when we were in a historic kind of as a format, a lot of the more janky cards and rares and things like that can be played without potentially affecting your deck weight as much, which I think is very interesting. But I okay, so basically, with what he's saying is that there's a couple of different like data points they weight your deck. The first is that it's going to weight based on your commander, and then that will give you kind of like, let's say it puts you in your commander in a tier 1, 2, 3, or 4, and then your deck weight might modify that a tier or two, in one or both directions. And he makes it seem like the deck weight is fairly modifying there. And so of course I read this about 3 months ago, and I really wanted to test it out. So basically, since we've gotten permanent Brawl, and there's been a lot of these things on deck weights, things like that, I have played about 1,000 games, a little over, 100 games with each of the two color combinations, another 100 games of a 5 color combination, and then also about another 100 games with changing out what I would call some of the variables for deck weight. And so let us get into that. I'm going to kind of go over what I approach for my data points, and we'll go from there. Okay, so here's kind of how we're going to visualize what I did. So I put in each row, I'm going to go over them all one at a time. Each one of the commanders that I would say is probably on like the upper end of like the tiers of commanders in the queue. And then I swapped the deck I was playing with them, which I would call a pretty standard deck or a pretty strong deck, with a commander that I put a lot lower on my own, at least personal tier list, and wanted to see how much that actually changed the queue. And then we did our same thing for 5 color, and then we have our data points for everything else. So first of all, we start with a couple commanders I think are incredibly strong with Sithis Harvest Hand, a standard enchantment build. I started this one right around the time we started talking more about it once the queue had been put in for the bug fix. And then I swapped it straight over to WotC the Sunsheart, and immediately it's noticeable that the people I'm facing are much different. Sithis still may not quite be at tier 1 of only facing like other tier 1s for the most part, But when I started playing WotC the Sun's Heart, like I started playing a lot of different decks, like a lot of decks I had not even seen would sit this out. And that held true for Galazeth Prismari being swapped over to Dalico's Crafter of Wonders. The same is also true for pretty much everything on here. Moving from 3-drop Domri to 4-drop Domri reduced the overall like quality of my opponent's commander. Maybe not necessarily the games, but like the quality of the commander significantly. The same by switching Tajik to Aurelia, and then changing out Uro over to Zagana. In my opinion, based on like the difficulty levels, I would say this probably dropped me at least a full tier, which is pretty crazy considering we only made like one change to the entire 100 card list. And this was over about 100 games. There were a couple outliers. I'm going to go over more about my outlier information based on how I have it recorded when we get to the end, but it has to do with something with the queue and the timing that you're in the queue for. There were 2 color combinations. So we're going to go over again. Switching Kaya to Aura also shifted the deck weight. Same with switching Ashiok over to Atrada and changing the Gitrog monster over to Azoni. However, there were 2 decks that it didn't really move very much. I don't know if I may have gotten shunted out of like the top tier, but it still kept me fairly high up. And that was first was switching over from Judith to Zagra, Thief of Heartbeats. The deck itself still felt like it was playing against very strong and high-tiered opponents. I hit a lot of other like Golos players, Teferi players, a lot of other like pretty big name decks. And then changing from Teferi, Hero of Dominaria over to Dovin, Grand Arbiter out of a control shell where everything stayed the same. So those 2 stayed the exact same. Pretty much. Like there were some very maybe minor changes, like Dovin went against the mirror match and other Teferis pretty often. Which was kind of an interesting play as well. So may go to show that maybe those decks are more weighted towards the cards in them than they are the 99. It is also important to note that when I give you this data, I didn't actually like just switch these within the 100 cards. Teferi was not in the deck at all. It was only Dovin, and vice versa. There's no Dovin in there for the rest of it. And yeah, so I mean, I had less than 10% of games on each color that were going to kind of be what I would call outlier games. And I kind of, so I could say it's a pretty decent, like a 90% accuracy rating with the changes I had here. And so I was kind of very interested to kind of see how that worked. And it appears as though at a base level, the commander is a very large portion of your deck weight. It just has to be based on the big changes that we're seeing there, which is changing 1 card of the 99. And I imagine that from there, if I'm switching from like a Gitrog monster, lands matter, self-mill kind of thing to an Azoni, trying to mill my own creatures, I'm probably taking out other powerful cards that are in Gitrog and lowering my deck weight even more, theoretically from what we've heard. Then on to 5 color, I switched from Golos, who's one of the boogeymen of the format, over to Tazri, Beacon of Unity. And that is... it was immediately noticeable. I went from fighting other Golos matchups, Keenan matchups, and Ashiok and Teferi to I didn't see a single one of them. And I'm still running pretty much like a 5-color good stuff kind of lands matter list. And then I do admit, I will give myself one thing. I really wish I had played Keenan instead of Uro. But when I didn't pick Keenan because I was worried because the rest of the deck that Keenan is in it probably has a much weaker deck weight without Keenan at the helm. So I was trying to find something that might be like a little bit more noticeable, if it's commander or not. But I didn't think about that at the time too much, and I went with Uro just like as a gut instinct. And I definitely wish I'd gone with Keenan with that one. So next, our data points moved us to, okay, let's change some of like the more talked about cards in the deck. So of course we did Field of the Dead, Narset Part of Reveals, Time Warp, Nisei Shakes the World, Paradox Engine, Ugin, Agent of Treachery, and Great Henge. All cards people have talked about potentially wanting banned in the format at the past, and cards that I think that are still pretty controversial in some games. And I thought, well, if anything's going to affect deck weight the most, it might be cards like these, if we're looking at like single data point type stuff. And so I basically played another 150 or so games. I think I'm at like a 147 right now. And I basically played half the games with it in, half the games with them out. Predominantly, the deck is being played in a Simic shell since they all fit in there fairly easily. I have 50 games in that Simic shell. I've got another 40 games in a 3-color cell using Chulane and Arcades. Forgot his name for a minute. And then I'm also using a 5-color pile using Sliver, the first Sliver. as like the commander for that to kind of test out what the weight of the shifting is in comparison. And right now, it could be due to the fact that I have other strong cards in the deck. So I'm still trying to like make decks that are good even without these cards. But I have not noticed any kind of matchmaking increase or decrease. I cannot have all these cards in the deck and still have matched with people who have Field of the Dead, who have Time Warp, things like that. You know, I've ran into enough Paradox Engine combos off of Ace Rack lists in any tier with any list at this point, that I'm not entirely sure that these really affect deck weight that much, or if they affect other things that are in there. So if we're to take what he says, that there is still some kind of like deck weighting for other cards, I would have to probably think that maybe it's more about synergies and stuff than that. Or, one of the big changes when you're talking about Commander, at least, is you move from Battle Cruiser, which has a very light interaction, a lot of like, big splashy things, to when you're playing more competitive, when like mana curves have been lowered, more removal is put in, more disruption. And so the next thing I'll be testing after this is potentially if interaction is what's affecting with the keys very much. Like if you are including a decent amount of interaction, you're going to play with people who actually have interaction. I'm not entirely sure though. That would be like my next point. But just from my own testing, it does not seem as though what you put in your deck matters nearly as much as what is actually like as your commander right now, outside of so far Judas Zagreus and then Dovin Teferi, which I guess is because functionally those cards do feel very similar when they're put into their own deck. But yeah, I'd really be interested to see more. But I think that for right now, I would not feel afraid to put in cards that are strong, like Field of the Dead, Agent of Treachery in your deck, because it doesn't appear as though you're suddenly going to like not face opponents that have those. That is to say that my data could be slightly skewed, because if they also include an MMR type system where you're fighting people with similar rank, I have a fairly high win rate in Brawl. I do play it a ton. It is my most played game mode. Obviously, I'm creating content around it too, but I would be surprised if that is involved, it completely changes. And there's one last thing I want to talk about, and that has to do with the function of the queue and the algorithm that finds you an opponent. Its goal is to try to get you into a game very quickly, so that you don't like close the game and like never log back on. You don't get frustrated. And so what I noticed in a lot of my outlier games where I fought something that I thought was completely out of the tier, for instance, like, Kaya going against a deck that had like only commons and uncommons that it looked like from like standard, I believe has mostly to do with the amount of time you've been in queue for. So the longer you're in queue, the less strict the parameters that it tries to find for you are on. And I definitely think, we've all experienced that. We've all hit that 45 seconds to a minute in queue time. And then all of a sudden it pops us up with like a commander that might be like a little bit above or below the tier I think we're playing in. And so I think that kind of it's one of those same things we've seen in other games. For instance, League of Legends does that. Like it'll actually like release the parameters for like how close you have to be in rank the longer the queue is. And so I would have to guess that it probably works something like that. I would also have to guess that it focuses less on necessarily individually good cards and more on synergy picking, similarly to how the AI draft does here in Magic Arena, where it finds data points based on how frequently this card combination wins, and then it tries to look at those data points into its algorithm. And so doing that, it in my opinion so far, especially with blue-white control, with a lot of board wipes and control pieces and counterspells, there's a lot of people who just instant concede to a deck like that. I tried not to include those in my data sets, if it didn't at least last to turn 4. But I do know there's a lot of people who would just like insta scoop if they get matched against like a certain commander, and most of the time that involves blue and white being played. Or like, if you the other thing was when I was playing black red, dropping a 1 drop, a 2 drop, a 3 drop, and just like boom, they're down to 10, and they've played like an arcane signet. A lot of people will concede very quickly at that point. And so potentially, because people are conceding to try to avoid games they just don't want to play, that could also be strengthening those two decks, like the cards inside of it. I have no real data to support that one. That's just kind of like the hunch I have feeling, based on like what I've seen through like the different subreddits and Facebook communities and Discords, is that those are kind of the deck types that people will most often just insta concede to. And so I'm sure that if their deck weighting is based off of like the amount of wins with certain synergy pickups, that could be what it's related to, is kind of like my best guess. But that is our video today, guys. If you liked it, please give me a comment and subscribe. And also, if you have anything you've done testing for, or you have any ideas for how you think it functions, like, I would love to hear it. This very interests me, and I kind of want to create this to have a resource out there for people to kind of talk about and try to discover a little bit more of like what it means by all this like deck weighting and stuff. Because there's a lot of people out there who I think are misinformed as to what it actually is, and there's also people out there who I think that are trying to take advantage of that. And I think it's important we kind of know what the idea is without necessarily knowing the specifics, but like that can give us an idea of kind of like what going forward. Like if you are somebody who wants to play more low powered games, and by not including X amount of cards, you can try to get a lower game, like that's totally cool. Or if you're somebody who like wants to spike it out and you're like, oh, if I can play like drop 5 or 6 different cards in there and like really kind of go power level up, like finding out this kind of information is going to be better for the player in the long run. I feel just my opinion. But I hope you enjoyed this. As always, be radiant.